Chapter 19 of the Montessori Method. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melissa. The Montessori Method by Maria Montessori. Translated by Anne E. George. Chapter 19. Teaching of Numeration. Introduction to Arithmetic. Children of 3 years already know how to count as far as 2 or 3 when they enter our schools. They therefore very easily learn numeration, which consists in counting objects. A dozen different ways may serve toward this end, and daily life presents many opportunities. When the mother says, for instance, "There are 2 buttons missing from your apron," or "We need 3 more plates at table." One of the first means used by me is that of counting with money. I obtain new money, and if it were possible, I should have good reproductions made in cardboard. I have seen such money used in a school for deficients in London. The making of change is a form of numeration so attractive as to hold the attention of the child. I present the 1, 2, and 4 centime pieces, and the children, in this way, learn to count to 10. No form of instruction is more practical than that tending to make children familiar with the coins in common use, and no exercise is more useful than that of making change. It is so closely related to real life that it interests all children immensely. Having taught numeration in this empiric mode, I pass to more methodical exercises, having as didactic material one of the set of blocks already used in the education of the senses, namely the series of 10 rods heretofore used for the teaching of length. The shortest of these rods corresponds to a decimeter, the longest to a meter, while the intervening rods are divided into sections a decimeter in length. The sections are painted alternately red and blue. Some day, when a child has arranged the rods, placing them in order of length, we have him count the red and blue signs, beginning with the smallest piece, that is, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, etc., always going back to 1 in the counting of each rod, and starting from the side A. We then have him name the single rods from the shortest to the longest, according to the total number of the sections which each contains, touching the rods at the sides B, on which side the stair ascends. This results in the same numeration as when we counted the longest rod, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Wishing to know the number of rods, we count them from side A, and the same numeration results, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This correspondence of the 3 sides of the triangle causes the child to verify his knowledge, and as the exercise interests him, he repeats it many times. We now unite to the exercises in numeration the earlier sensory exercises in which the child recognized the long and short rods. Having mixed the rods upon a carpet, the directress selects one, and showing it to the child, has him count the sections, for example, 5. She then asks him to give her the next one in length. He selects it by his eye, and the directress has him verify his choice by placing the 2 pieces side by side and by counting their sections. Such exercises may be repeated in great variety, and through them the child learns to assign a particular name to each one of the pieces in the long stair. We may now call them piece number 1, piece number 2, etc., and finally, for brevity, may speak of them in the lessons as 1, 2, 3, etc. The numbers as represented by the graphic signs. At this point, if the child already knows how to write, we may present the figures cut in sandpaper and mounted upon cards. In presenting these, the method is the same used in teaching the letters. This is 1, this is 2. Give me 1. Give me 2. What number is this? The child traces the number with his fingers as he did with the letters. Exercises with numbers. Association of the graphic sign with the quantity. I have designed 2 trays, each divided into 5 little compartments. At the back of each compartment may be placed a card bearing a figure. The figures in the first tray should be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and in the second, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The exercise is obvious. It consists in placing within the compartments a number of objects corresponding to the figure indicated upon the card at the back of the compartment. We give the children various objects in order to vary the lesson, but chiefly make use of large wooden pegs so shaped that they will not roll off the desk. We place a number of these before the child, whose part is to arrange them in their places, one peg corresponding to the card marked 1, etc. When he has finished, he takes his tray to the directress that she may verify his work. The lesson on 0. We wait until the child, pointing to the compartment containing the card marked 0, asks, "And what must I put in here?" We then reply, "Nothing. 0 is nothing." But often this is not enough. It is necessary to make the child feel what we mean by nothing. To this end we make use of little games which vastly entertain the children. I stand among them, and turning to one of them, who has already used this material, I say, "Come, dear, come to me 0 times." The child almost always comes to me, and then runs back to his place. "But, my boy, you came 1 time, and I told you to come 0 times." Then he begins to wonder, "But what must I do then?" "Nothing. 0 is nothing." "But how shall I do nothing?" Don't do anything. You must sit still. You must not come at all, not any times. 0 times, no times at all." I repeat these exercises until the children understand, and they are then immensely amused at remaining quiet when I call to them to come to me 0 times, or to throw me 0 kisses. They themselves often cry out, "0 is nothing! 0 is nothing!" Exercises for the memory of numbers. When the children recognize the written figure, and when this figure signifies to them the numerical value, I give them the following exercise. I cut the figures from old calendars and mount them upon slips of paper, which are then folded and dropped into a box. The children draw out the slips, carry them still folded to their seats, where they look at them and refold them, conserving the secret. Then, one by one, or in groups, these children, who are naturally the oldest ones in the class, go to the large table of the directress, where groups of various small objects have been placed. Each one selects the quantity of objects corresponding to the number he has drawn. The number, meanwhile, has been left at the child's place, a slip of paper mysteriously folded. The child, therefore, must remember his number, not only during the movements which he makes in coming and going, but while he collects his pieces, counting them one by one. The directress may here make interesting individual observations upon the number memory. When the child has gathered up his objects, he arranges them upon his own table in columns of 2, and if the number is uneven, he places the odd piece at the bottom and between the last two objects. The arrangement of the pieces is therefore as follows. The crosses represent the objects, while the circle stands for the folded slip containing the figure. Having arranged his objects, the child awaits the verification. The directress comes, opens the slip, reads the number, and counts the pieces. When we first played this game, it often happened that the children took more objects than were called for upon the card, and this was not always because they did not remember the number, but arose from a mania for having the greatest number of objects. A little of that instinctive greediness, which is common to primitive and uncultured man. The directress seeks to explain to the children that it is useless to have all those things upon the desk, and that the point of the game lies in taking the exact number of objects called for. Little by little they enter into this idea, but not so easily as one might suppose. It is a real effort of self-denial, which holds the child within the set limit, and makes him take, for example, only 2 of the objects placed at his disposal, while he sees others taking more. I therefore consider this game more an exercise of will-power than of numeration. The child, who has the 0, should not move from his place when he sees all his companions rising and taking freely of the objects which are inaccessible to him. Many times 0 falls to the lot of a child who knows how to count perfectly, and who would experience great pleasure in accumulating and arranging a fine group of objects in the proper order upon his table, and in awaiting with security the teacher's verification. It is most interesting to study the expressions upon the faces of those who possess 0. The individual differences which result are almost a revelation of the character of each one. Some remain impassive, assuming a bold front in order to hide the pain of the disappointment. Others show this disappointment by involuntary gestures. Still others cannot hide the smile which is called forth by the singular situation in which they find themselves, and which will make their friends curious. There are little ones who follow every movement of their companions with a look of desire, almost of envy, while others show instant acceptance of the situation. No less interesting are the expressions with which they confess to the holding of the 0, when asked during the verification, "And you haven't taken anything?" "I have 0. It is 0. These are the usual words, but the expressive face, the tone of the voice, show widely varying sentiments. Rare indeed are those who seem to give with pleasure the explanation of an extraordinary fact. The greater number either look unhappy or merely resigned. We therefore give lessons upon the meaning of the game, saying, "It is hard to keep the 0 secret. Hold the paper tightly and don't let it slip away. It is the most difficult of all." Indeed, after a while, the very difficulty of remaining quiet appeals to the children, and when they open the slip marked 0, it can be seen that they are content to keep the secret. Addition and subtraction from 1 to 20, multiplication and division. The didactic material which we use for the teaching of the first arithmetical operations is the same already used for numeration. That is, the rods graduated as to length, which, arranged on the scale of the meter, contain the first idea of the decimal system. The rods, as I have said, have come to be called by the numbers which they represent, 1, 2, 3, etc. They are arranged in order of length, which is also in order of numeration. The first exercise consists in trying to put the shorter pieces together in such a way as to form tens. The most simple way of doing this is to take successively the shortest rods, from 1 up, and place them at the end of the corresponding long rods, from 10 down. This may be accompanied by the commands, "Take 1 and add it to 9. take 2 and add it to 8, take 3 and add it to 7, take 4 and add it to 6. In this way, we make 4 rods equal to 10. There remains the 5, but turning this upon its head in the long sense, it passes from one end of the 10 to the other, and thus makes clear the fact that 2 times 5 makes 10. These exercises are repeated, and little by little the child is taught the more technical language. 9 plus 1 equals 10, 8 plus 2 equals 10, 7 plus 3 equals 10, 6 plus 4 equals 10, and for the 5, which remains, 2 times 5 equals 10. At last, if he can write, we teach the signs plus and equal and times. Then this is what we see in the neat notebooks of our little ones. 9 plus 1 equals 10. 8 plus 2 equals 5. 5 times 2 equals 10. 7 plus 3 equals 10. 6 plus 4 equals 10. When this is well learned and has been put upon the paper with great pleasure by the children, we call their attention to the work which is done when the pieces grouped together to form tens are taken apart and put back in their original positions. From the 10 last formed we take away 4, and 6 remains. From the next we take away 3, and 7 remains. From the next 2, and 8 remains. From the last we take away 1, and 9 remains. Speaking of this properly, we say 10 less 4 equals 6, 10 less 3 equals 7, 10 less 2 equals 8, 10 less 1 equals 9. In regard to the remaining 5, it is the half of 10, and by cutting the long rod in two, that is, dividing 10 by 2, we would have 5. 10 divided by 2 equals 5. The written record of all this reads, 10 minus 4 equals 6. 10 minus 3 equals 7. 10 divided by 2 equals 5. 10 minus 2 equals 8. 10 minus 1 equals 9. Once the children have mastered this exercise, they multiply it spontaneously. Can we make 3 in 2 ways? We place the 1 after the 2, and then write, in order that we may remember what we have done, 2 plus 1 equals 3. Can we make 2 rods equal to number 4? 3 plus 1 equals 4, and 4 minus 3 equals 1. 4 minus 1 equals 3. Rod number 2, in its relation to rod number 4, is treated as was 5 in relation to 10. That is, we turn it over and show that it is contained in 4 exactly 2 times. 4 divided by 2 equals 2. 2 times 2 equals 4. Another problem. Let us see with how many rods we can play this same game. We can do it with 3 and 6, and with 4 and 8. That is, 2 times 2 equals 4, 3 times 2 equals 6, 4 times 2 equals 8, 5 times 2 equals 10. 10 divided by 2 equals 5, 8 divided by 2 equals 4, 6 divided by 2 equals 3, 4 divided by 2 equals 2. At this point, we find that the cubes with which we played the number memory games are of help. From this arrangement one sees at once which are the numbers which can be divided by 2, all those which have not an odd cube at the bottom. These are the even numbers, because they can be arranged in pairs, 2 by 2, and the division by 2 is easy, all that is necessary being to separate the 2 lines of 2's that stand one under the other. Counting the cubes of each file, we have the quotient. To recompose the primitive number, we need only reassemble the 2 files thus: 2 times 3 equals 6. All this is not difficult for children of 5 years. The repetition soon becomes monotonous, but the exercises may be most easily changed. Taking again the set of long rods, and instead of placing rod number 1 after 9, place it after 10. In the same way, place 2 after 9 and 3 after 8. In this way we make rods of a greater length than 10, lengths which we must learn to name 11, 12, 13, etc., as far as 20. The little cubes, too, may be used to fix these higher numbers. Having learned the operations through 10, we proceed with no difficulty to 20. The one difficulty lies in the decimal numbers, which require certain lessons. Lessons on decimals, arithmetical calculations beyond 10. The necessary didactic material consists of a number of square cards, upon which the figure 10 is printed in large type, and of other rectangular cards, half the size of the square, and containing the single numbers from 1 to 9. We place the numbers in a line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then, having no more numbers, we must begin over again, and take the 1 again. This 1 is like that section in the set of rods, which, in rod number 10, extends beyond 9. Counting along the stair as far as 9, there remains this one section which, as there are no more numbers, we again designate as 1. But this is a higher 1 than the first, and to distinguish it from the first, we put near it a 0, a sign which means nothing. Here, then, is 10. Covering the 0 with the separate rectangular number cards in the order of their succession, we see formed 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. These numbers are composed by adding to rod number 10, first rod number 1, then 2, then 3, etc., until we finally add rod number 9 to rod number 10, thus obtaining a very long rod, which, when its alternating red and blue sections are counted, gives us 19. The directress may then show to the child the cards, giving the number 16, and he may place rod 6 after rod 10. She then takes away the card bearing 6 and places over the 0 the card bearing the figure 8, whereupon the child takes away rod 6 and replaces it with rod 8, thus making 18. Each of these acts may be recorded thus: 10 plus 6 equals 16, 10 plus 18 equals 18, etc. We proceed in the same way to subtraction. When the number itself begins to have a clear meaning to the child, the combinations are made upon one long card, arranging the rectangular cards bearing the 9 figures upon the 2 columns of numbers shown in the figures A and B. Upon the card A, we superimpose upon the 0 of the second 10 the rectangular card bearing the 1, and under this the one bearing 2, etc. Thus, while the 1 of the 10 remains the same, the numbers to the right proceed from 0 to 9 thus. In card B, the applications are more complex. The cards are superimposed in numerical progression by tens. Almost all our children count to 100, a number which is given to them in response to the curiosity they showed in regard to learning it. I do not believe that this phase of the teaching needs further illustrations. Each teacher may multiply the practical exercises and the arithmetical operations, using simple objects which the children can readily handle and divide. End of Chapter 19. Teaching of Numeration. Introduction to Arithmetic. Recording by Melissa.
Chapter 20 of the Montessori Method. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leni. The Montessori Method, by Maria Montessori, translated by N.E. George. Chapter 20, Sequence of Exercises. In the practical application of the method, it is helpful to know the sequence, or the various series, of exercises which must be presented to the child successively. In the first edition of my book, there was clearly indicated a progression for each exercise. But in the Children's Houses, we began contemporaneously with the most varied exercises, and it develops that there exist grades in the presentation of the material in its entirety. These grades have, since the first publication of the book, become clearly defined through experience in the Children's Houses. Sequence and grades in the presentation of material and in the exercises. First grade. As soon as the child comes to the school, he may be given the following exercises: moving the seats in silence, practical life; lacing, buttoning, hooking, etc. The cylinders, sense exercises. Among these, the most useful exercise is that of the cylinders, solid insets. The child here begins to fix his attention. He makes his first comparison, his first selection, in which he exercises judgment. Therefore, he exercises his intelligence. Among these exercises with the solid insets, there exists the following progression from easy to difficult. A. The cylinders in which the pieces are of the same height and of decreasing diameter. B. The cylinders decreasing in all dimensions. C. Those decreasing only in height. Second grade. Exercises of practical life: to rise and be seated in silence, to walk on the line. Sense exercises. Material dealing with dimensions: the long stair, the prisms or big stair, the cubes. Here, the child makes exercises in the recognition of dimensions, as he did in the cylinders, but under a very different aspect. The objects are much larger. The differences much more evident than they were in the preceding exercises, but here only the eye of the child recognizes the differences and controls the errors. In the preceding exercises, the errors were mechanically revealed to the child by the didactic material itself. The impossibility of placing the objects in order in the block in any other than their respective spaces gives this control. Finally, while in the preceding exercises the child makes much more simple movements, being seated he places little objects in order with his hands, in these new exercises he accomplishes movements which are decidedly more complex and difficult, and makes small muscular efforts. He does this by moving from the table to the carpet, rises, kneels, carries heavy objects. We notice that the child continues to be confused between the two last pieces in the growing scale, being for a long time unconscious of such an error after he has learned to put the other pieces in correct order. Indeed, the difference between these pieces being through the varying dimensions the same for all, the relative difference diminishes with the increasing size of the pieces themselves. For example, the little cube, which has a base of 2 centimeters, is double the size, as to base, of the smallest cube, which has a base of 1 centimeter, while the largest cube, having a base of 10 centimeters, differs by barely 1/10 from the base of the cube next it in the series, the one of 9 centimeters base. Thus, it would seem that, theoretically, in such exercises we should begin with the smallest piece. We can, indeed, do this with the material through which size and length are taught, but we cannot do so with the cubes, which must be arranged as a little tower. This column of blocks must always have as its base the largest cube. The children, attracted above all by the tower, begin very early to play with it. Thus, we often see very little children playing with the tower, happy in believing that they have constructed it, when they have inadvertently used the next to the largest cube as the base. But when the child, repeating the exercise, corrects himself of his own accord in a permanent fashion, we may be certain that his eye has become trained to perceive even the slightest differences between the pieces. In the 3 systems of blocks through which dimensions are taught, that of length has pieces differing from each other by 10 centimeters, while in the other two sets, the pieces differ only 1 centimeter. Theoretically, it would seem that the long rods should be the first to attract the attention and to exclude errors. This, however, is not the case. The children are attracted by this set of blocks, but they commit the greatest number of errors in using it, and only after they have for a long time eliminated every error in constructing the other two sets do they succeed in arranging the long stair perfectly. This may then be considered as the most difficult among the series through which dimensions are taught. Arrived at this point in his education, the child is capable of fixing his attention, with interest, upon the thermic and tactile stimuli. The progression in the sense development is not, therefore, in actual practice identical with the theoretical progression which psychometry indicates in the study of its subjects. Nor does it follow the progression which physiology and anatomy indicate in the description of the relations of the sense organs. In fact, the tactile sense is the primitive sense. The organ of touch is the most simple and the most widely diffused. But it is easy to explain how the most simple sensations, the least complex organs, are not the first through which to attract the attention in a didactic presentation of sense stimuli. Therefore, when the education of the attention has been begun, we may present to the child the rough and smooth surfaces, following certain thermic exercises described elsewhere in this book. These exercises, if presented at the proper time, interest the children immensely. It is to be remembered that these games are of the greatest importance in the method, because upon them, in union with the exercises for the movement of the hand, which we introduced later, we base the acquisition of writing. Together with the two series of sense exercises described above, we may begin what we call the pairing of the colors, that is, the recognition of the identity of two colors. This is the first exercise of the chromatic sense. Here also it is only the eye of the child that intervenes in the judgment, as it was with the exercises in dimension. This first color exercise is easy, but the child must already have acquired a certain grade of education of the attention through preceding exercises, if he is to repeat this one with interest. Meanwhile, the child has heard music, has walked on the line, while the directress played a rhythmic march. Little by little, he has learned to accompany the music spontaneously with certain movements. This, of course, necessitates the repetition of the same music. To acquire the sense of rhythm, the repetition of the same exercise is necessary, as in all forms of education dealing with spontaneous activity. The exercises in silence are also repeated. Third grade. Exercises of practical life. The children wash themselves, dress and undress themselves, dust the tables, learn to handle various objects, etc. Sense exercise. We now introduce the child to the recognition of gradations of stimuli, tactile gradations, chromatic, etc., allowing him to exercise himself freely. We begin to present the stimuli for the sense of hearing, sounds, noises, and also the baric stimuli, the little tablets differing in weight. Contemporaneously with the gradations, we may present the plain geometric insets. Here begins the education of the movement of the hand in following the contours of the insets, an exercise which, together with the other and contemporaneous one of the recognition of tactile stimuli in gradation, prepares for writing. The series of cards bearing the geometric forms we give after the child recognizes perfectly the same forms in the wooden insets. These cards serve to prepare for the abstract signs, of which writing consists. The child learns to recognize a delineated form, and after all the preceding exercises have formed within him an ordered and intelligent personality, they may be considered the bridge by which he passes from the sense exercises to writing, from the preparation to the actual entrance into instruction. Fourth grade. Exercises of practical life. The children sat and cleared the table for luncheon. They learned to put a room in order. They are now taught the most minute care of their persons in the making of the toilet, how to brush their teeth, to clean their nails, etc. They have learned, through the rhythmic exercises on the line, to walk with perfect freedom and balance. They know how to control and direct their own movements, how to make the silence, how to move various objects without dropping or breaking them and without making a noise. Sense exercises. In this stage, we repeat all the sense exercises. In addition, we introduce the recognition of musical notes by the help of the series of duplicate bells. Exercises related to writing. Design. The child passes to the plain geometric insets in metal. He has already coordinated the movements necessary to follow the contours. Here, he no longer follows them with his finger, but with a pencil, leaving the double sign upon a sheet of paper. Then, he fills in the figures with colored pencils, holding the pencil as he will later hold the pen in writing. Contemporaneously, the child is taught to recognize and touch some of the letters of the alphabet made in sandpaper. Exercises in arithmetic. At this point, repeating the sense exercises, we present the long stare with a different aim from that with which it has been used up to the present time. We have the child count the different pieces according to the blue and red sections, beginning with the rod consisting of one section and continuing through that composed of 10 sections. We continue such exercises and give other more complicated ones. In design, we pass from the outlines of the geometric insets to such outline figures as the practice of 4 years has established and which will be published as models in design. These have an educational importance and represent in their content and in their gradations one of the most carefully studied details of the method. They serve as a means for the continuation of the sense education and help the child to observe his surroundings. They thus add to his intellectual refinement, and, as regards writing, they prepare for the high and low strokes. After such practice, it will be easy for the child to make high or low letters, and this will do away with the ruled notebooks such as are used in Italy in the various elementary classes. In the acquiring of the use of written language, we go as far as the knowledge of the letters of the alphabet and of composition with the movable alphabet. In arithmetic, as far as a knowledge of the figures. The child places the corresponding figures beside the number of blue and red sections on each rod of the long stair. The children now take the exercise with the wooden pegs. Also, the game which consists in placing under the figures on the table a corresponding number of colored counters. These are arranged in columns of 2s, thus making the question of odd and even numbers clear. This arrangement is taken from Séguin. 5th grade. We continue the preceding exercises. We begin more complicated rhythmic exercises. In design, we begin: A. The use of watercolors. B. Free drawing from nature, flowers, etc. Composition of words and phrases with the movable alphabet. A. Spontaneous writing of words and phrases. B. Reading from slips prepared by the directress. We continue the arithmetical operations which we began with the long stair. The children at this stage present most interesting differences of development. They fairly run toward instruction and order their intellectual growth in a way that is remarkable. This joyous growth is what we so rejoice in, and we watch in these children humanity growing in the spirit according to its own deep laws. And only he who experiments can say how great may be the harvest from the sowing of such seed. End of chapter 20. Sequence of exercises.
Chapter 21. General Review of Discipline. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
Montessori Method
By Maria Montessori. Translated by Anne E. George. Chapter 21. The accumulated experience we have had since the publication of the Italian version has repeatedly proved to us that in our classes of little children, numbering 40 and even 50, the discipline is much better than in ordinary schools. For this reason, I have thought that an analysis of the discipline obtained by our method, which is based upon liberty, would interest my American readers. Whoever visits a well-kept school, such as, for instance, the one in Rome, directed by my pupil Anna Maccheroni, is struck by the discipline of the children. There are 40 little beings, from 3 to 7 years old, each one intent on his own work. One is going through one of the exercises for the senses, one is doing an arithmetical exercise, one is handling the letters, one is drawing, one is fastening and unfastening the pieces of cloth on one of our little wooden frames, still another is dusting. Some are seated at the tables, some on rugs on the floor. There are muffled sounds of objects lightly moved about, of children tiptoeing. Once in a while comes a cry of joy, only partly repressed. "Teacher, teacher!" An eager call, "Look! See what I've done!" But as a rule, there is entire absorption in the work at hand. The teacher moves quietly about, goes to any child who calls her, supervising operations in such a way that anyone who needs her finds her at his elbow, and whoever does not need her is not reminded of her existence. Sometimes hours go by without a word. They seem little men, as they were called by some visitors to the children's house, or, as another suggested, judges in deliberation. In the midst of such intense interest in work, it never happens that quarrels arise over the possession of an object. If one accomplishes something especially fine, his achievement is a source of admiration and joy to others. No heart suffers from another's wealth, but the triumph of one is a delight to all. Very often he finds ready imitators. They all seem happy and satisfied to do what they can, without feeling jealous of the deeds of others. The little fellow of 3 works peaceably beside the boy of 7, just as he is satisfied with his own height, and does not envy the older boy's stature. Everything is growing in the most profound peace. If the teacher wishes the whole assembly to do something, for instance, leave the work which interests them so much, all she needs to do is to speak a word in a low tone, or make a gesture, and they are all attention. They look toward her with eagerness, anxious to know how to obey. Many visitors have seen the teacher write orders on the blackboard, which were obeyed joyously by the children. Not only the teachers, but anyone who asks the pupils to do something is astonished to see them obey in the minutest detail and with obliging cheerfulness. Often a visitor wishes to hear how a child, now painting, can sing. The child leaves his painting to be obliging, but the instant his courteous action is completed he returns to his interrupted work. Sometimes the smaller children finish their work before they obey. A very surprising result of this discipline came to our notice during the examinations of the teachers who had followed my course of lectures. These examinations were practical, and accordingly groups of children were put at the disposition of the teachers being examined, who, according to the subject drawn by lot, took the children through a given exercise. While the children were waiting their turn, they were allowed to do just as they pleased. They worked incessantly, and returned to their undertakings as soon as the interruption caused by the examination was over. Every once in a while one of them came to show us a drawing made during the interval. Miss George of Chicago was present many times when this happened, and Madame Pujols, who founded the first children's house in Paris, was astonished at the patience, the perseverance, and the inexhaustible amiability of the children. One might think that such children had been severely repressed were it not for their lack of timidity, for their bright eyes, for their happy, free aspect, for the cordiality of their invitations to look at their work, for the way in which they take visitors about and explain matters to them. These things make us feel that we are in the presence of the masters of the house, and the fervor with which they throw their arms around the teacher's knees, with which they pull her down to kiss her face, shows that their little hearts are free to expand as they will. Anyone who has watched them setting the table must have passed from one surprise to another. Little 4-year-old waiters take the knives and forks and spoons and distribute them to the different places. They carry trays holding as many as 5 water glasses, and finally they go from table to table, carrying big tureens full of hot soup. Not a mistake is made, not a glass is broken, not a drop of soup is spilled. All during the meal, unobtrusive little waiters watch the table assiduously. Not a child empties his soup plate without being offered more. If he is ready for the next course, a waiter briskly carries off his soup plate. Not a child is forced to ask for more soup, or to announce that he has finished. Remembering the usual condition of 4-year-old children, who cry, who break whatever they touch, who need to be waited on, everyone is deeply moved by the sight I have just described, which evidently results from the development of energies latent in the depths of the human soul. I have often seen the spectators at this banquet of little ones moved to tears. But such discipline could never be obtained by commands, by sermonizings, in short, through any of the disciplinary devices universally known. Not only were the actions of those children set in an orderly condition, but their very lives were deepened and enlarged. In fact, such discipline is on the same plane with school exercises extraordinary for the age of the children, and it certainly does not depend upon the teacher, but upon a sort of miracle occurring in the inner life of each child. If we try to think of parallels in the life of adults, we are reminded of the phenomenon of conversion, of the superhuman heightening of the strength of martyrs and apostles, of the constancy of missionaries, of the obedience of monks. Nothing else in the world, except such things, is on a spiritual height equal to the discipline of the children's houses. To obtain such discipline, it is quite useless to count on reprimands or spoken exhortations. Such means might perhaps at the beginning have an appearance of efficacy, but very soon, the instant that real discipline appears, all of this falls miserably to the earth, an illusion confronted with reality. Night gives way to day. The first dawning of real discipline comes through work. At a given moment it happens that a child becomes keenly interested in a piece of work, showing it by the expression of his face, by his intense attention, by his perseverance in the same exercise. That child has set foot upon the road leading to discipline. Whatever be his undertaking, an exercise for the senses, an exercise in buttoning up or lacing together, or washing dishes, it is all one and the same. On our side we can have some influence upon the permanence of this phenomenon, by means of repeated lessons of silence. The perfect immobility, the attention alert to catch the sound of the names whispered from a distance, then the carefully coordinated movements executed so as not to strike against chair or table, so as barely to touch the floor with the feet. All this is a most efficacious preparation for the task of setting in order the whole personality, the motor forces and the psychical. Once the habit of work is formed, we must supervise it with scrupulous accuracy, graduating the exercises as experience has taught us. In our effort to establish discipline, we must rigorously apply the principles of the method. It is not to be obtained by words. No man learns self-discipline through hearing another man speak. The phenomenon of discipline needs as preparation a series of complete actions, such as are presupposed in the genuine application of a really educative method. Discipline is reached always by indirect means. The end is obtained not by attacking the mistake and fighting it, but by developing activity in spontaneous work. This work cannot be arbitrarily offered, and it is precisely here that our method enters. It must be work which the human being instinctively desires to do, work towards which the latent tendencies of life naturally turn, or towards which the individual step by step ascends. Such is the work which sets the personality in order, and opens wide before it infinite possibilities of growth. Take for instance the lack of control shown by a baby. It is fundamentally a lack of muscular discipline. The child is in a constant state of disorderly movement. He throws himself down, he makes queer gestures, he cries. What underlies all this is a latent tendency to seek that coordination of movement which will be established later. The baby is a man not yet sure of the movements of the various muscles of the body, not yet master of the organs of speech. He will eventually establish these various movements, but for the present he is abandoned to a period of experimentation full of mistakes and of fatiguing efforts toward a desirable end latent in his instinct, but not clear in his consciousness. To say to the baby, "Stand still as I do," brings no light into his darkness. Commands cannot aid in the process of bringing order into the complex psychomuscular system of an individual in process of evolution. We are confused at this point by the example of the adult who through a wicked impulse prefers disorder, and who may, granted that he can, obey a sharp admonishment which turns his will in another direction, towards that order which he recognizes, and which it is within his capacity to achieve. In the case of the little child, it is a question of aiding the natural evolution of voluntary action. Hence it is necessary to teach all the coordinated movements, analyzing them as much as possible, and developing them bit by bit. Thus, for instance, it is necessary to teach the child the various degrees of immobility leading to silence, the movements connected with rising from a chair and sitting down, with walking, with tiptoeing, with following a line drawn on the floor, keeping an upright equilibrium. The child is taught to move objects about, to set them down more or less carefully, and finally the complex movements connected with dressing and undressing himself, analyzed on the lacing and buttoning frames at school. And for even each of these exercises, the different parts of the movement must be analyzed. Perfect immobility and the successive perfectioning of action is what takes the place of the customary command, "Be quiet! Be still!" It is not astonishing, but very natural that the child by means of such exercises should acquire self-discipline, so far as regards the lack of muscular discipline natural to his age. In short, he responds to nature because he is in action, but these actions being directed towards an end have no longer the appearance of disorder, but of work. This is discipline which represents an end to be attained by means of a number of conquests. The child disciplined in this way is no longer the child he was at first, who knows how to be good passively, but he is an individual who has made himself better, who has overcome the usual limits of his age, who has made a great step forward, who has conquered his future in his present. He has therefore enlarged his dominion. He will not need to have someone always at hand to tell him vainly, confusing two opposing conceptions, "Be quiet, be good." The goodness he has conquered cannot be summed up by inertia. His goodness is now all made up of action. As a matter of fact, good people are those who advance towards the good, that good which is made up of their own self-development and of external acts of order and usefulness. In our efforts with the child, external acts are the means which stimulate internal development, and they again appear as its manifestation, the two elements being inextricably intertwined. Work develops the child spiritually, but the child with a fuller spiritual development works better, and his improved work delights him. Hence he continues to develop spiritually. Discipline is, therefore, not a fact, but a path in following which the child grasps the abstract conception of goodness with an exactitude which is fairly scientific. But beyond everything else he savours the supreme delights of that spiritual order which is attained indirectly through conquests directed towards determinate ends. In that long preparation the child experiences joys, spiritual awakenings, and pleasures which form his inner treasure house, the treasure house in which he is steadily storing up the sweetness and strength which will be the sources of righteousness. In short, the child has not only learned to move about and to perform useful acts, he has acquired a special grace of action which makes his gestures more correct and attractive, and which beautifies his hands, and indeed his entire body, now so balanced and so sure of itself. A grace which refines the expression of his face and his serenely brilliant eyes, and which shows us that the flame of spiritual life has been lighted in another human being. It is obviously true that coordinated actions, developed spontaneously, little by little, that is, chosen and carried out in the exercises by the child himself, must call for less effort than the disorderly actions performed by the child who is left to his own devices. True rest for muscles, intended by nature for action, is in orderly action, just as true rest for the lungs is the normal rhythm of respiration taken in pure air. To take action away from the muscles is to force them away from their natural motor impulse, and hence, besides tiring them, means forcing them into a state of degeneration, just as the lungs forced into immobility would die instantly, and the whole organism with them. It is therefore necessary to keep clearly in mind the fact that rest, for whatever naturally acts, lies in some specified form of action, corresponding to its nature. To act in obedience to the hidden precepts of nature, that is rest, and in this special case, since man is meant to be an intelligent creature, the more intelligent his acts are, the more he finds repose in them. When a child acts only in a disorderly, disconnected manner, his nervous force is under a great strain, while on the other hand his nervous energy is positively increased and multiplied by intelligent actions which give him real satisfaction, and a feeling of pride that he has overcome himself, that he finds himself in a world beyond the frontiers formerly set up as insurmountable, surrounded by the silent respect of the one who has guided him without making his presence felt. This multiplication of nervous energy represents a process which can be physiologically analyzed, and which comes from the development of the organs by rational exercise, from better circulation of the blood, from the quickened activity of all the tissues, all factors favorable to the development of the body and guaranteeing physical health. The spirit aids the body in its growth. The heart, the nerves, and the muscles are helpful in their evolution by the activity of the spirit, since the upward path for soul and body is one and the same. By analogy, it can be said of the intellectual development of the child, that the mind of infancy, although characteristically disorderly, is also a means searching for its end, which goes through exhausting experiments, left, as it frequently is, to its own resources, and too often really persecuted. Once in our public park in Rome, the Pincian Gardens, I saw a baby of about a year and a half, a beautiful smiling child who was working away trying to fill a little pail by shoveling gravel into it. Beside him was a smartly dressed nurse, evidently very fond of him, the sort of nurse who would consider that she gave the child the most affectionate and intelligent care. It was time to go home, and the nurse was patiently exhorting the baby to leave his work, and let her put him into the baby carriage. Seeing that her exhortations made no impression on the little fellow's firmness, she herself filled the pail with gravel and set pail and baby into the carriage with the fixed conviction that she had given him what he wanted. I was struck by the loud cries of the child and by the expression of protest against violence and injustice which wrote itself on his little face. What an accumulation of wrongs weighed down that nascent intelligence! The little boy did not wish to have the pail full of gravel. He wished to go through the motions necessary to fill it, thus satisfying a need of his vigorous organism. The child's unconscious aim was his own self-development, not the external fact of a pail full of little stones. The vivid attractions of the external world were only empty apparitions. The need of his life was a reality. As a matter of fact, if he had filled his pail, he would probably have emptied it out again in order to keep on filling it up until his inner self was satisfied. It was the feeling of working towards this satisfaction which, a few moments before, had made his face so rosy and smiling. Spiritual joy, exercise, and sunshine were the three rays of light ministering to his splendid life. The commonplace episode in the life of that child is a detail of what happens to all children, even the best and most cherished. They are not understood because the adult judges them by his own measure. He thinks that the child's wish is to obtain some tangible object and lovingly helps him to do this, whereas the child as a rule has for his unconscious desire his own self-development. Hence he despises everything already attained and yearns for that which is still to be sought for. For instance, he prefers the action of dressing himself to the state of being dressed, even finely dressed. He prefers the act of washing himself to the satisfaction of being clean. He prefers to make a little house for himself rather than merely to own it. His own self-development is his true and almost his only pleasure. The self-development of the little baby up to the end of his first year consists to a large degree in taking in nutrition, but afterwards it consists in aiding the orderly establishment of the psychophysiological functions of his organism. That beautiful baby in the Pincian Gardens is the symbol of this. He wished to coordinate his voluntary actions, to exercise his muscles by lifting, to train his eye to estimate distances, to exercise his intelligence in the reasoning connected with his undertaking, to stimulate his willpower by deciding his own actions. Whilst she who loved him, believing that his aim was to possess some pebbles, made him wretched. A similar error is that which we repeat so frequently when we fancy that the desire of the student is to possess a piece of information. We aid him to grasp intellectually this detached piece of knowledge, and preventing by this means his self-development, we make him wretched. It is generally believed in schools that the way to attain satisfaction is to learn something, but by leaving the children in our schools in liberty, we have been able with great clearness to follow them in their natural method of spontaneous self-development. To have learned something is for the child only a point of departure. When he has learned the meaning of an exercise, then he begins to enjoy repeating it, and he does repeat it in an infinite number of times, with the most evident satisfaction. He who enjoys executing that act because by means of it he is developing his psychic activities. There results from the observation of this fact a criticism of what is done today in many schools. Often, for instance, when the pupils are questioned, the teacher says to someone who is eager to answer, "No, not you, because you know it," and puts her question specially to the pupils who she thinks are uncertain of the answer. Those who do not know are made to speak, those who do know to be silent. This happens because of the general habit of considering the act of knowing something as final. And yet, how many times it happens to us in ordinary life to repeat the very thing we know best, the thing we care most for, the thing to which some living force in us responds. We love to sing musical phrases very familiar, hence enjoyed and become a part of the fabric of our lives. We love to repeat stories of things which please us, which we know very well, even though we are quite aware that we are saying nothing new. No matter how many times we repeat the Lord's Prayer, it is always new. No two persons could be more convinced of mutual love than sweethearts, and yet they are the very ones who repeat endlessly that they love each other. But in order to repeat in this manner There must first exist the idea to be repeated. A mental grasp of the idea is indispensable to the beginning of repetition. The exercise which develops life consists in the repetition, not in the mere grasp of the idea. When a child has obtained this stage of repeating an exercise, he is on the way to self-development, and the external sign of this condition is his self-discipline. This phenomenon does not always occur. The same exercises are not repeated by children of all ages. In fact, repetition corresponds to a need. Here steps in the experimental method of education. It is necessary to offer those exercises which correspond to the need of development felt by an organism. And if the child's age has carried him past a certain need, it is never possible to obtain, in its fullness, a development which missed its proper moment. Hence children grow up, often fatally and irrevocably, imperfectly developed. Another very interesting observation is that which relates to the length of time needed for the execution of actions. Children who are undertaking something for the first time are extremely slow. Their life is governed in this respect by laws especially different from ours. Little children accomplish slowly and perseveringly various complicated operations agreeable to them, such as dressing, undressing, cleaning the room, washing themselves, setting the table, eating, etc. In all this they are extremely patient, overcoming all the difficulties presented by an organism still in process of formation. But we, on the other hand, noticing that they are tiring themselves out or wasting time in accomplishing something which we would do in a moment and without the least effort, put ourselves in the child's place and do it ourselves. Always with the same erroneous idea that the end to be obtained is the completion of the action, we dress and wash the child, we snatch out of his hands objects which he loves to handle, we pour the soup into his bowl, we feed him, we set the table for him. And after such services, we consider him, with that injustice always practiced by those who domineer over others, even with benevolent intentions, to be incapable and inept. We often speak of him as impatient, simply because we are not patient enough to allow his actions to follow laws of time differing from our own. We call him tyrannical, exactly because we employ tyranny towards him. This stain, this false imputation, this calumny on childhood has become an integral part of the theories concerning childhood, in reality so patient and gentle. The child, like every strong creature fighting for the right to live, rebels against whatever offends that occult impulse within him which is the voice of nature, and which he ought to obey, and he shows by violent actions, by screaming and weeping, that he has been overborne and forced away from his mission in life. He shows himself to be a rebel, a revolutionist, an iconoclast, against those who do not understand him, and who, fancying that they are helping him, are really pushing him backward in the highway of life. Thus even the adult who loves him rivets about his neck another calumny, confusing his defense of his molested life with a form of innate naughtiness characteristic of little children. What would become of us if we fell into the midst of a population of jugglers, or of lightning change impersonators of the variety hall? What should we do if, as we continued to act in our usual way, we saw ourselves assailed by these sleight-of-hand performers, hustled into our clothes, fed so rapidly that we could scarcely swallow, if everything we tried to do was snatched from our hands and completed in a twinkling, and we ourselves reduced to impotence and a humiliating inertia? Not knowing how else to express our confusion, we would defend ourselves with blows and yells from these madmen, and they, having only the best will in the world to serve us, would call us haughty, rebellious, and incapable of doing anything. We, who know our own milieu, would say to those people, "Come into our countries and you will see the splendid civilization we have established. You will see our wonderful achievements." These jugglers would admire us infinitely, hardly able to believe their eyes, as they observed our world so full of beauty and activity, so well regulated, so peaceful, so kindly, but all so much slower than theirs. Something of this sort occurs between children and adults. It is exactly in the repetition of the exercise that the education of the senses consists. Their aim is not that the child shall know colors, forms, and the different qualities of objects, but that he refine his senses through an exercise of attention, of comparison, of judgment. These exercises are true intellectual gymnastics. Such gymnastics, reasonably directed by means of various devices, aid in the formation of the intellect, just as physical exercises fortify the general health and quicken the growth of the body. The child who trains his various senses separately, by means of external stimuli, concentrates his attention and develops piece by piece his mental activities, just as with separately prepared movements he trains his muscular activities. These mental gymnastics are not merely psychosensory, but they prepare the way for spontaneous association of ideas, for ratiocination developing out of definite knowledge, for a harmoniously balanced intellect. They are the powder trains that bring about those mental explosions which delight the child so intensely when he makes discoveries in the world about him, when he, at the same time, ponders over and glories in the new things which are revealed to him in the outside world, and in the exquisite emotions of his own growing consciousness. And finally, when there spring up within him, almost by a process of spontaneous ripening, like the internal phenomena of growth, the external products of learning, writing and reading. I happened once to see a 2-year-old child, son of a medical colleague of mine, who, fairly fleeing away from his mother who had brought him to me, threw himself on the litter of things covering his father's desk, the rectangular writing pad, the round cover of the inkwell. I was touched to see the intelligent little creature trying his best to go through the exercises which our children repeat with such endless pleasure till they have fully committed them to memory. The father and the mother pulled the child away, reproving him, and explaining that there was no use trying to keep that child from handling his father's desk furniture. The child is restless and naughty. How often we see all children reproved, because, though they are told not to, they will take hold of everything. Now it is precisely by means of guiding and developing this natural instinct to take hold of everything, and to recognize the relations of geometrical figures, that we prepare our little 4-year-old men for the joy and triumph they experience later over the phenomenon of spontaneous writing. The child who throws himself on the writing pad, the cover to the inkwell, and such objects, always struggling in vain to attain his desire, always hindered and thwarted by people stronger than he, always excited and weeping over the failure of his desperate efforts, is wasting nervous force. His parents are mistaken if they think that such a child ever gets any real rest, just as they are mistaken when they call haughty the little man longing for the foundations of his intellectual edifice. The children in our schools are the ones who are really at rest, ardently and blessedly free to take out and put back in their right places or grooves the geometric figures offered to their instinct for higher self-development. And they, rejoicing in the most entire spiritual calm, have no notion that their eyes and hands are initiating them into the mysteries of a new language. The majority of our children become calm as they go through such exercises, because their nervous system is at rest. Then we say that such children are quiet and good. External discipline, so eagerly sought after in ordinary schools, is more than achieved. However, as a calm man and a self-disciplined man are not one and the same, so here the fact which manifests itself externally by the calm of the children is in reality a phenomenon merely physical and partial compared to the real self-discipline which is being developed in them. Often, and this is another misconception, we think all we need to do to obtain a voluntary action from a child is to order him to do it. We pretend that this phenomenon of a forced voluntary action exists, and we call this pretext the obedience of the child. We find little children specially disobedient, or rather their resistance, by the time they are 4 or 5 years old, has become so great that we are in despair, and are almost tempted to give up trying to make them obey. We force ourselves to praise little children the virtue of obedience, a virtue which, according to our accepted prejudices, should belong specially to infancy, should be the infantile virtue, yet we fail to learn anything from the fact that we are led to emphasize it so strongly because we can only with the greatest difficulty make children practice it. It is a very common mistake, this of trying to obtain by means of prayers or orders or violence what is difficult or impossible to get. Thus, for instance, we ask little children to be obedient, and little children in their turn ask for the moon. We need only reflect that this obedience, which we treat so lightly, occurs later as a natural tendency in older children, and then as an instinct in the adult to realize that it springs spontaneously into being, and that it is one of the strongest instincts of humanity. We find that society rests on a foundation of marvelous obedience, and that civilization goes forward on a road made by obedience. Human organizations are often founded on an abuse of obedience. Associations of criminals have obedience as their keystone. How many times social problems center about the necessity of rousing man from a state of obedience which has led him to be exploited and brutalized? Obedience naturally is sacrifice. We are so accustomed to an to an infinity of obedience in the world, to a condition of self-sacrifice, to a readiness for renunciation, that we call matrimony the blessed condition, although it is made up of obedience and self-sacrifice. The soldier, whose lot in life is to obey if it kills him, is envied by the common people, while we consider anyone who tries to escape from obedience as a malefactor or a madman. Besides, how many people have had the deeply spiritual experience of an ardent desire to obey something or some person leading them along the path of life? More than this, a desire to sacrifice something for the sake of this obedience. It is therefore entirely natural that, loving the child, we should point out to him that obedience is the law of life, and there is nothing surprising in the anxiety felt by nearly everyone who is confronted with the characteristic disobedience of little children. But obedience can only be reached through a complex formation of the psychic personality. To obey, it is necessary not only to wish to obey, but also to know how to. Since when a command to do a certain thing is given, we presuppose a corresponding active or inhibitive power of the child, it is plain that obedience must follow the formation of the will and the mind. To prepare in detail this formation by means of detached exercises is therefore indirectly to urge the child towards obedience. The method which is the subject of this book contains in every part an exercise for the will power, when the child completes coordinated actions directed towards a given end, when he achieves something he set out to do, when he repeats patiently his exercises, he is training his positive willpower. Similarly, in a very complicated series of exercises, he is establishing through activity his powers of inhibition. For instance, in the lesson of silence, which calls for a long continued inhibition of many actions, while the child is waiting to be called, and later for a rigorous self-control when he is called, and would like to answer joyously and run to his teacher, but instead is perfectly silent, moves very carefully, taking the greatest pains not to knock against chair or table or to make a noise. Other inhibited exercises are the arithmetical ones, when the child, having drawn a number by lot, must take from the great mass of objects before him, apparently entirely at his disposition, only the quantity corresponding to the number in his hand, whereas, as experience has proved, he would like to take the greatest number possible. Furthermore, if he chances to draw the 0, he sits patiently with empty hands. Still, another training for the inhibitive willpower is in the lesson of 0, when the child, called upon to come up 0 times and give 0 kisses, stands quiet, conquering with a visible effort the instinct which would lead him to obey the call. The child at our school dinners who carries the big tureen full of hot soup isolates himself from every external stimulant which might disturb him, resists his childish impulse to run and jump, does not yield to the temptation to brush away the fly on his face, and is entirely concentrated on the great responsibility of not dropping or tipping the tureen. A little thing of 4 1/2, every time he set the tureen down at a table so that the little guests might help themselves, gave a hop and a skip, then took up the tureen again to carry it to another table, repressing himself to a sober walk. In spite of his desire to play, he never left his task before he had passed soup to the 20 tables, and he never forgot the vigilance necessary to control his actions. Willpower, like all other activities, is invigorated and developed through methodical exercises, and all our exercises for willpower are also mental and practical. To the casual onlooker, the child seems to be learning exactitude and grace of action, to be refining his senses, to be learning how to become his own master, how to be a man of prompt and resolute will. We often hear it said that a child's will should be broken, that the best education for the will of the child is to learn to give it up to the will of adults. Leaving out of the question the injustice which is at the root of every act of tyranny, this idea is irrational, because the child cannot give up what he does not possess. We prevent him in this way from forming his own willpower, and we commit the greatest and most blameworthy mistake. He never has time or opportunity to test himself, to estimate his own force and his own limitations, because he is always interrupted and subjected to our tyranny, and languishes in injustice because he is always being bitterly reproached for not having what adults are perpetually destroying. There springs up as a consequence of this childish timidity, which is a moral malady acquired by a will which could not develop, and with which the usual calumny which with the tyrant, consciously or not, covers up his own mistakes, we consider as an inherent trait of childhood. The children in our schools are never timid. One of their most fascinating qualities is the frankness with which they treat people, with which they go on working in the presence of others, and showing their work frankly, calling for sympathy. That moral monstrosity, a repressed and timid child, who is at his ease nowhere except alone with his playmates or with street urchins, because his willpower was allowed to grow only in the shade, disappears in our schools. He presents an example of thoughtless barbarism, which resembles the artificial compression of the bodies of those children intended for court dwarfs, museum monstrosities, or buffoons. Yet this is the treatment under which nearly all of the children of our time are growing up spiritually. As a matter of fact, in all the pedagogical congresses, one hears that the great peril of our time is the lack of individual character in the scholars. Yet these alarmists do not point out that this condition is due to the way in which education is managed, to scholarly slavery, which has for its specialty the repression of willpower and of force of character. The remedy is to enfranchise human development. Besides the exercises it offers for developing willpower, the other factor in obedience is the capacity to perform the act it becomes necessary to obey. One of the most interesting observations made by my pupil, Anna Maccheroni, at first in the school in Milan, and then in the Via Giusti in Rome, relates to the connection between obedience in a child and his knowing how. Obedience appears in the child as a latent instinct as soon as his personality begins to take form. For instance, a child begins to try a certain exercise, and suddenly sometime he goes through it perfectly. He's delighted, stares at it, and wishes to do it over again. But for some time the exercise is not a success. Then comes a time when he can do it nearly every time he tries, voluntarily, but makes mistakes if someone else asks him to do it. The external command does not as yet produce the voluntary act. When, however, the exercise always succeeds with absolute certainty, then an order from someone else brings about on the child's part orderly, adequate action. That is, the child is able each time to execute the command received. That these facts, with variations in individual cases, are laws of psychical development, is apparent from everyone's experience with children in home, in school, or at home. One often hears a child say, "I did do such and such a thing, but now I can't." And a teacher disappointed by the incompetence of a pupil will say, "Yet that child was doing it all right, and now he can't." Finally, there is the period of complete development in which the capacity to perform some operation is permanently acquired. There are, therefore, 3 periods. A first, subconscious one, when in the confused mind of the child, order produces itself by a mysterious inner impulse from out of the midst of disorder, producing as an external result a completed act, which, however, being outside the field of consciousness, cannot be reproduced at will. A second, conscious period, when there is some action on the part of the will which is present during the process of the development and establishing of the acts. And a third period, when the will can direct and cause the acts, thus answering the command from someone else. Now, obedience follows a similar sequence. When in the first period of spiritual disorder, the child does not obey, it is exactly as if he were physically deaf, and out of hearing of commands. In the second period he would like to obey. He looks as though he understood the command and would like to respond to it, but cannot, or at least does not always succeed in doing it, is not quick to mind, and shows no pleasure when he does. In the third period he obeys at once, with enthusiasm, and as he becomes more and more perfect in the exercises, he is proud that he knows how to obey. This is the period in which he runs joyously to obey, and leaves at the most imperceptible request whatever is interesting him, so that he may quit the solitude of his own life and enter, with the act of obedience, into the spiritual existence of another. To this order, established in a consciousness formerly chaotic, are due all the phenomena of discipline and of mental development, which open out like a new creation. From minds thus set in order, when night is separated from day, come sudden emotions and mental feats which recall the biblical story of creation. The child has in his mind not only what he has laboriously acquired, but the free gifts which flow from spiritual life, the first flowers of affection, of gentleness, of spontaneous love for righteousness, which perfume the souls of such children and give promise to the fruits of the Spirit of St. Paul. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness. They are virtuous because they exercise patience in repeating their exercises, long-suffering in yielding to the commands and desires of others, good in rejoicing in the well-being of others without jealousy or rivalry. They live doing good in joyousness of heart and in peace, and they are eminently, marvelously industrious. But they are not proud of such righteousness because they were not conscious of acquiring it as a moral superiority. They have set their feet in the path leading to righteousness, simply because it was the only way to attain true self-development and learning, and they enjoy with simple hearts the fruits of peace that are to be gathered along that path. These are the first outlines of an experiment which shows a form of indirect discipline in which there is substituted for the critical and sermonizing teacher a rational organization of work and of liberty for the child. It involves a conception of life more usual in religious fields than in those of academic pedagogy, inasmuch as it has recourse to the spiritual energies of mankind, but it is founded on work and on liberty, which are the two paths to all civic progress. End of Chapter 21. General Review of Discipline.
Chapter 22 of the Montessori Method. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elena. The Montessori Method by Maria Montessori, translated by Anne E. George. Chapter 22. Conclusions and Impressions. In The Children's Houses, the old-time teacher who wore herself out maintaining discipline of immobility and who wasted her breath in loud and continual discourse has disappeared. For this teacher we have substituted the didactic material, which contains within itself the control of errors and which makes auto-education possible to each child. The teacher has thus become a director of the spontaneous work for the children. She is not a passive force, a silent presence. The children are occupied, each one in a different way, and the directress, watching them, can make psychological observations which, if collected in an orderly way and according to scientific standards, should do much towards the reconstruction of child psychology and the development of experimental psychology. I believe that I have, by my method, established the conditions necessary to the development of scientific pedagogy, and whoever adopts this method opens, in doing so, a laboratory of experimental pedagogy. From such work we must await the positive solution of all those pedagogical problems of which we talk today. For through such work there has already come the solution of some of these very questions, that of the liberty of the pupils, auto-education, the establishment of harmony between the work and activities of home life and school tasks, making both work together for the education of the child. The problem of religious education, the importance of which we do not fully realize, should also be solved by positive pedagogy. If religion is born with civilizations, its roots must lie deep in human nature. We have had most beautiful proof of an instinctive love of knowledge in the child, who has too often been misjudged in that he has been considered addicted to meaningless play and games void of thought. The child who left the game in his eagerness for knowledge has revealed himself as a true son of that humanity which has been throughout the centuries the creator of scientific and civil progress. We have belittled the Son of Man by giving him foolish and degrading toys, a world of idleness where he is suffocated by a badly conceived discipline. Now in his liberty, the child should show us, as well, where the man is by nature a religious creature. To deny, a priori, the religious sentiment in man, and to deprive humanity of the education of this sentiment, is to commit a pedagogical error similar to that of denying a priori to the child the love of learning for learning's sake. This ignorant assumption led us to dominate the scholar, to subject him to a species of slavery in order to render him apparently disciplined. The fact that we assume that religious education is only adapted to the adult may be akin to another profound error existing in education today, namely, that of overlooking the education of the senses at the very period when this education is possible. The life of the adult is practically an application of the senses to the gathering of sensations from their environment. A lack of preparation for this often results in inadequacy in practical life, in that lack of poise which causes so many individuals to waste their energies in purposeless effort. Not to form a parallel between the education of the senses as a guide to practical life and religious education as a guide to moral life, but for the sake of illustration, let me call attention to how often we find inefficiency, instability among irreligious persons, and how much precocious individual power is miserably wasted. How many men have had this experience? And when that spiritual awakening comes late, as sometimes it does, through the softening power of sorrow, the mind is unable to establish an equilibrium because he has grown too much accustomed to a life deprived of spirituality. We see equally piteous cases of religious fanaticism, or we look upon intimate dramatic struggles between the heart, ever seeking its own safe and quiet port, and the mind that constantly draws it back to the sea of conflicting ideas and emotions where peace is unknown. These are all psychological phenomena of the highest importance. They present perhaps the gravest of all our human problems. We Europeans are still filled with prejudices and hedged about with preconceptions in regards to these matters. We are slaves of thought. We believe that liberty of conscience and of thought consists in denying certain sentimental beliefs, while liberty can never exist where one struggles to stifle some other thing, but only where unlimited expansion is granted, where life is left free and untrammelled. He who really does not believe does not fear that which he does not believe, and does not combat that which for him does not exist. If he believes and fights, then he becomes an enemy to liberty. In America, the great positive scientist William James, who expounds the psychological theory of emotions, is also the man who illustrates the psychological importance of religious conscience. We cannot know the future of the progress of thought here. For example, in the children's houses, the triumph of discipline through the conquest of liberty and independence marked the foundation of the progress which the future will see in the matter of pedagogical methods. To me, it offers the greatest hope for human redemption through education. Perhaps in the same way, through the conquest of liberty of thought and of conscience, we are making our way towards a great religious triumph. Experience will show, and the psychological observations made along this line in the children's houses will undoubtedly be of the greatest interest. This book of methods, compiled by one person alone, must be followed by many others. It is my hope that, starting from the individual study of the child, educated with our method, other educators will set forth the results of their experiments. These are the pedagogical books which will await us in the future. From the practical side of the school, we have with our method the advantage of being able to teach in one room children of very different ages. In our children's houses, we have little ones of 2 years and a half who cannot as of yet make use of even the most simple of the sense exercises, and children of 5 and a half who, because of their development, might easily pass into the 3rd elementary. Each one of them perfects himself through his own powers and goes forward guided by that inner force which distinguishes him as an individual. One great advantage of such a method is that it will make instruction in the rural schools easier, and will be of great advantage in the schools in the small provincial towns where there are few children, yet where all the various grades are represented. Such schools are not able to employ more than one teacher. Our experience shows that one directress may guide a group of children varying in development from little ones of 3 years old to the 3rd elementary. Another great advantage lies in the extreme facility with which written language may be taught, making it possible to combat illiteracy and to cultivate the national tongue. As to the teacher, she may remain for the whole day among children in the most varying states of development, just as the mother remains in the house with children of all ages without becoming tired. The children work by themselves and, in doing so, make a conquest of active discipline and independence in all acts of daily life, just as through daily conquest they progress in intellectual development. Directed by an intelligent teacher who watches over their physical development as well as their intellectual and moral progress, children are able, with our methods, to arrive at a splendid physical development, and, in addition to this, there unfolds within them, in all its perfection, the soul, which distinguishes the human being. We have been mistaken in thinking that the natural education of children should be purely physical. The soul, too, has its nature, which it was intended to perfect in the spiritual life, the dominating power of human existence throughout all time. Our methods take into consideration the spontaneous psychic development of the child and help this in ways that observation and experience have shown us to be wise. If physical care leads the child to take pleasure in bodily health, intellectual and moral care make possible for him the highest spiritual joy, and send him forward into a world where continual surprises and discoveries await him, not only in the external environment, but in the intimate recesses of his own soul. It is through such pleasures as these that the ideal man grows, and only such pleasures are worthy of a place in the education of the infancy of humanity. Our children are noticeably different from those who have grown up within the grey walls of the common schools. Our little pupils have the serene and happy aspect and the frank and open friendliness of the person who feels himself to be master of his own actions. When they run to gather about our visitors, speaking to them with sweet frankness, extending their little hands and with gentle gravity and well-bred cordiality, when they thank these visitors for the courtesy they have paid us in coming, the bright eyes and the happy voices make us feel that they are, indeed, unusual little men. When they display their work and their ability in a confidential and simple way, it is almost as if they called for a maternal approbation from all those who watch them. Often, a little one will seat himself on the floor beside some visitor, silently writing his name and adding a gentle word of thanks. It is as if they wish to make the visitor feel the affectionate gratitude which is in their hearts. When we see all these things, and when, above all, we pass with these children from the busy activities of the schoolroom at work into the absolute and profound silence which they have learned to enjoy so deeply, we are moved in spite of ourselves and feel that we have come in touch with the very souls of these little pupils. The children's house seems to exert a spiritual influence upon everyone. I have seen here men of affairs, great politicians preoccupied with problems of trade and of state, cast off like an uncomfortable garment the burdens of the world, and fall into a simple forgetfulness of self. They are affected by this vision of the human soul growing in its true nature, and I believe that this is what they mean when they call our little ones wonderful children, happy children, the infancy of humanity in a higher stage of evolution than our own. I understand how the great English poet Wordsworth, enamoured as he was of nature, demanded the secret of all her peace and beauty. It was at last revealed to him. The secret of all nature lies in the soul of a little child. He holds there the true meaning of that life which exists throughout humanity. But this beauty which lies about us in our infancy becomes obscured. Shades of the prison house begin to clothe us about the growing boy. At last the man perceives it die away and fade into the light of common day. Truly our social life is too often only the darkening and the death of the natural life that is in us. These methods tend to guard that spiritual life within man, to keep his real nature unspoiled, and to set it free from the oppressive and degrading yoke of society. It is a pedagogical method informed by the higher concept of Immanuel Kant. Perfect art returns to nature. End of recording. End of chapter 22, Conclusions and Impressions. End of the Montessori Method by Maria Montessori, translated by Anne E. George.